Good morning and good afternoon. Thanks for joining us today. This is Phil Breitenbuscher. I'm the Director of the National Family Drug Court Training and Technical Assistance Program, which is supported by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. We appreciate all of your time today and your interest in this topic. Today we're going to talk about the National Strategic Plan for Family Drug Courts. One vision, three goals, to serve more families in future generations. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge again our funders, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and I would like to acknowledge also that the points and views or opinions expressed by me today are those of me and do not necessarily represent the official position of the Department of Justice. So in the next 50 minutes or so, I'm going to try to get through 3 points during this session. The first is kind of explore the family drug court movement and start with purpose. Why did we need a national strategic plan for family drug courts? What was the purpose of that? And we believe that if we don't all agree on the purpose, then we will argue over the plan. And this is true with any type of collaborative project or task that you might take on. If you and your wife are working to clean out the garage, or you and your husband are working to clean out the garage, if you don't agree on the purpose of why you're doing that work, you'll probably argue over the plan or how to do that work. And that's the same with any project that you might be working on. So let's talk about the purpose first. Then I'll provide an overview of the National Strategic Plan and the 3 goals and some of the strategies that are contained within it. And then I'm going to try to leave you with some concrete next steps that you can do in your own communities, in your own states, to advance the family drug court movement. So I'm going to try to get through those 3 important points in less than an hour. So first question we'd like you to answer for us is, if you've had the chance to read the National Strategic Plan, please raise your hand using the feature in the panel box. And I want to just give you a second to do that, and we'll see how many hands pop up. It looks like we're seeing quite a few of you. Lots of hands. Great. Excellent. All right. Well, that's okay. If you haven't read it yet, we're going to give you the cliff notes, and then hopefully it'll inspire you to go back and read it later. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move forward. Thanks for raising your hand. We went ahead and cleared your hands for now, so if you do have a question and you would like us to come back to you, if you raise your hand, that'll let us know. There's also a question box. So let's go back a little bit when we talk about the purpose. And we talk about, sometimes you'll hear us talk about, we've been here before. In the 1980s, there was the crack cocaine epidemic, if you will. In the 1990s, many of us who started in the family drug court arena started in the late 90s, early 2000s, and many of us were inundated with methamphetamine or speed or crank or whatever they called it in your local area. And we needed a response to that. And so a couple innovative judges, and we'll talk about this later, began to think about the adult drug court model as a potential solution to address these very critical and serious issues that were bringing children into our foster care system and into our court systems. And what we were seeing is that these families typically experience poor outcomes. They're less likely to reunify with their parents, more likely to have their parents' parental rights terminated. They tended to stay in foster care longer than children without substance abuse. And there needed to be some type of solution. When local child welfare agencies and folks working in the court systems began to try to address some of these issues on their own, they realized there was challenges with child welfare, substance use disorder treatment, and the court systems being able to partner together. It felt like there were these 3 siloed systems that didn't share data, that didn't have communication protocols in place, that didn't have ways for them to talk to each other, to hand off clients. And so it was really left for clients many times were given a list of referrals, and it was incumbent upon the client, the parent, to figure out a way to get themselves into treatment, and then figure out a way for that treatment episode to be reported back to their caseworker or to the courts to show that they were in compliance with their cases. And again, we'll talk about where we've come since then as we now face kind of the opioid and heroin epidemic across our country. And I wanted to underscore this because we hear it often across our country, and that absolutely we're seeing an opioid epidemic across our country, and too many children are losing, and too many parents are losing children to this epidemic. But we also recognize that methamphetamine hasn't gone away, and that in certain places we're certainly seeing a reemergence of methamphetamine, and not only the methamphetamine of the 90s, but in many cases much stronger, much purer methamphetamine and much cheaper. And I think that's true with opioids too. You're seeing really strong heroin for very cheap prices. And so here we find ourselves in this new era where, again, through most of the 2000s, we saw the rate of children entering foster care going down in most places around the country. And these last few years, we're beginning to see an uptick in which we're seeing more children, again, begin to enter foster care. So that nice graphic where we saw consistent downward trend has now begun to turn upward over the last few years. And so in addition to that, the fastest growing population of children entering foster care are children under the age of 1. So we have more kids coming into care, and we have younger children coming into care, which then leaves us with very short amount of time to intervene with these families who have long-term substance use disorders. Just to put this in some context, today, over 730 children will be removed from their parents. This hour, while we're talking, about 30 children will be removed. 5 of these will be babies under the age of 1. Another number that we sometimes use is that every 4 minutes, a child will be removed from their parents due to parental substance use disorders. So we find ourselves in a day, in an age where the clock is ticking very rapidly. We often talk about the ticking clocks, and this kind of helps us put into perspective of a need to do things better, more effectively, more strategically. So going back in time a little bit into the family drug court movement, we go back to the early days of the 90s in which 2 very innovative judges were at a national conference, Judge Parnham and Judge McGee out of Pensacola, Florida, and Reno, Nevada, respectively. And they were scratching their head thinking, conversing, saying to each other, geez, we are seeing skyrocketing caseloads, and lots of these families are coming into our courthouses because of substance use. In the case of Judge McGee, much of that was methamphetamine. In the case of Judge Parnham, lots of that was cocaine. And they heard about this thing called drug court, and they decided to try and plop it down into a dependency court setting. This began to get some traction in the late 90s, and a few others jumped on board and started trying to apply the 10 key components of adult drug court into dependency court. And by the late 90s, OJJDP and the Department of Justice thought that they should learn more about what was happening in child welfare in these new family drug courts. And in 2002, after completing a retrospective study and going out and doing a kind of qualitative assessment of some of the earliest family drug courts, 6 common ingredients were identified. A 7th would later be identified and added to those common ingredients in 2015. That helped provide somewhat of a framework for evaluation and for understanding how these types of programs work. That in some ways then led to legitimizing these courts, and other federal agencies began providing grants, both through OJJDP, BJA, SAMHSA, Children's Bureau. Funding became available in the early 2000s and continued throughout. In 2007 and moving to 2010, we really started seeing enhancement grants for family drug courts. So not only were we looking at the federal funders to help us implement these family drug courts, but now we're moving into enhancements. How could we enhance the services for children? How could we be trauma-informed? How could we be integrating evidence-based programs into these family drug courts? And what also came with those grant funds was an intensive amount of evaluation and research. And that led us to know what works and in many ways, how it works. In 2014, we began to think about how family drug courts could be part of a systems change process. So we wanted to move away from small boutique family drug court projects across our country and thinking about how is really family drug courts part of a larger movement to change systems and advance justice for children and families. We're now at a place where we're really focusing and working with family drug courts across our country to institutionalize or to become institutionalized, which means they become part of the fabric of your community. That in your own community, it's impossible to think about what your community would look like without a family treatment court. I think about Wapello, Iowa, as an example of this. In Wapello, population of about 30,000, their family treatment court is part of who that community is. It's truly infused and it's sustained. And it's these types of innovations, these system changes, this massive growth, and our current opioid epidemic, the number of young babies coming into our systems that led us, and some of us came together in 2015 to come together to say what we need as a nation, as a field of practitioners, is that we need one national strategic plan that brings us all together and paves the way to serve more children. It's another way to look at the family drug court movement just in terms of numbers and growth over time. We did see somewhat of a downtick. In other words, some family drug courts closed in the between 2013 and 2015 due to the recession. But we're seeing, again, a numbers increase. And the latest inventory we have is from 2016, in which we were able to document 370 active family treatment courts. And I would think that number's increased since then. I believe just in Ohio alone, they now have 32 family drug courts in the state of Ohio. So this is a rapidly growing field, and again, points to the need for a strategic plan. Part of the reason why family drug courts have been so successful is that not only do the courts hold parents accountable and help them get into treatment and do all of those things, but that we also hold systems accountable, that we become accountable to each other, that child welfare is accountable to treatment, and treatment is accountable to the courts. And that accountability leads to trust, that we can trust the treatment provider will call us if there is a positive drug test. We trust that the court, defense attorneys trust that the court really has the best interest of this family at heart. So accountability and trust are part of what makes family drug courts work so well. Along with these 7 key ingredients, and I'm going to go through these quickly because many of you, if not most all of you, have probably seen these 7 ingredients before. But these are critical to have an effective family treatment court. First of all, you have to have a system of identifying families. It needs to be systematic, in contrast to relational. Not just that some people like family treatment court in your community and other people don't, but that each and every family has the equal opportunity to be given access to the family treatment court. Secondly, family treatment courts have to establish relationships with their treatment providers and their treatment agencies so that clients have timely access to a clinical and structured assessment and then timely access to appropriate treatment services. Third, there has to be some type of increased case management of recovery services, expecting that the child welfare worker with their typical caseload is going to be able to provide this enhanced case management will not produce the type of outcomes that we typically see in well-run family treatment courts. So there has to be some type of way to increase the case management for these families who have very high needs. The next one, the 4th one, which is also sometimes known as the 7th one, it's the newest, is that to really see the type of improved outcomes that we like to see in family treatment courts, there need to be improved family-centered services and a focus on that parent-child relationship at the earliest point possible. So having parents and children treated or in groups together, having parents spending time with their children as quickly and as frequently and as safely as possible is critical for the family treatment courts to be effective. 5th, of course, there has to be increased judicial oversight. We like to see courts bringing back parents and families every other week at a minimum in the first phase of the program. Many courts are bringing back parents every single week in the first phase, the first 30 days, to ensure that parents are getting appropriate assessments, they're getting engaged in treatment, and those types of things. We also like to see, and well-run family treatment courts work best when that judicial oversight also is holding systems accountable. So if we ask a parent to go down and get an assessment and she shows up on a Wednesday and she stands online and she makes it into the lobby and the receptionist tells her that they're very glad she showed up. However, they only do 5 assessments a day and she happens to be number 6. She'll have to come back next week. That when they come back to court later in that week, there will be some accountability and we'll ensure that that mother is able to get in to a timely assessment. And we could also talk about other agencies and the importance of that increased judicial oversight. 6, we like to see a systematic response for participants' behavior or using contingency management theory, sometimes called sanctions and incentives, sometimes called responses, rewards, and adjustments. So there's different terms that we use in family treatment courts, but the importance is that we're responding quickly to the participants' behavior and their needs throughout the week, and certainly having clear responses during your treatment court sessions. And lastly, but certainly not least, there needs to be a collaborative, non-adversarial approach grounded in efficient communication across service systems and the court. So this really needs to be a collaborative approach, bringing together at minimum your treatment, your child welfare, and your court systems coming together on a frequent basis to not only staff cases and to communicate about individual cases, but also to work on your policy, procedures, and other types of institutional barriers that may limit the progress or the outcomes that your parents are facing or working towards. When those things are done, we like to see, or we often see that these 5 R's are improved. We see that the recovery, parents move into recovery sometimes much sooner. We see them getting access into treatment sooner. They stay in treatment longer. They complete treatment at higher rates. We like to call the first R also improved recovery of the family. That the parent-child relationships are improving. The second R is more and more courts are working to front load these services and keep kids at home. So a high number of kids are able to remain at home when the parents participate in the family treatment court. We see reunification rates greatly improved, both timeliness of reunification and stability of those reunifications. We see that repeat maltreatment and re-entry into foster care are greatly reduced once parents participate in the family treatment court, or families participate. So I'm going to take a pause just briefly and ask our first polling question. So please indicate your status, and you can read your options there, and we'll give you a few minutes, or just a few seconds, I should say, to respond to this polling question. So it's nearly 60% of you have been in operation for more than 5 years. That's great to hear. Another about 30% or 25% of you are operational 1 to 5 years, and then another 17% or so are starting or would like to learn more about it. So thank you for responding, and it really helps know the audience here. So we have a lot of experienced professionals on the call today. So that's great, because that's who I want to send this message to, is really those of you that have been doing this work for more than 2 years. This is something I want to speak specifically to you about now. Those of you that are thinking about doing this work, we're grateful that you're here today, and we think that this will be a message that will still be helpful for you. But this particular message, I'm going to speak directly to those of you, the 60% or 70% that have been doing this for 2 or more years, and I'm going to challenge you a bit. Today we think there are at least 370 family drug courts, but unfortunately many are serving between 5 or 10% of eligible families, and many much less than that. There is a great need for this type of work. We don't necessarily think family drug courts are the silver bullet or the only answer to serving families in the child welfare system with a substance use disorder. However, they should be part of that solution, and they should be part of the system that addresses this large need that we have in our nation. And so what will it take for us to advance this justice, to advance these programs to a larger set of families? Is it fair that if a child happens to be removed from their mother or from their father, and they happen to live just on the other side of the tracks, or they happen to live on just outside of the zip code in which you take families, is that fair that that child may have to spend 100 days longer in foster care? Is it fair that they are likely to experience 66 percent more likely to experience a repeat maltreatment. Is that fair? Is that reasonable? These are questions that are sometimes asked. And is it fair that you are at capacity when an infant is removed from their mother and that mother is not able to get into your program? Is that fair? Is that just? These are questions that those of us that have been doing this work for a long time have to begin to ask ourselves. And these are the types of questions that, again, pushed us towards developing the National Strategic Plan, where our vision is that every family in the child welfare system affected by parental or caregiver substance use disorders will have timely access to comprehensive and coordinated screening, assessment, and service delivery for family success. That's the vision of the strategic plan. Let me just go into how we developed it, and then I'm going to go through the three major goals of the Family Drug Court. As I said earlier, we started in 2015 with resources from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, brought us together in Georgetown, in Washington, D.C. There were about 70 or 80 of us that participated in a multi-day listening session. And out of that came the recommendation to develop, or the need for a national strategic plan. We put together a group of practitioners and policymakers, researchers, evaluators, foundations, federal partners, advocates that worked together to then draft a strategic plan and ultimately publish it in March of 2017. So here's our webinar today. Part of what we're now moving into is how do we begin to implement the goals and the strategies that are detailed in the strategic plan. And in some ways, this today is a call to action for many of you. So what's it going to take? So we have three straightforward goals. One, we want to ensure that we're implementing family treatment courts or family drug courts with fidelity, with quality implementation. Second, we want to expand the reach of family drug courts. And third, we want to build the evidence base on what works for family drug courts and who it works for. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail now. So the first one is to improve the effectiveness of existing family drug courts by assuring it operates with fidelity to the family drug court model. And I would say not only existing, but if you're in that first two categories in our last polling question in which you're exploring the idea of implementing one or you're in the planning process, we also are speaking to you here. We want you to be implementing those programs with fidelity. And so we're in the first process of developing national model standards for family drug courts. We were just in Washington, D.C. last week with our work group, our advisory group, who's helping us develop these national standards, and we expect to have them published for all of you by September of 2018. Sometimes we hear there are challenges to quality implementation, such as difficulty accessing the full array of services needed, inadequate systems for identifying, screening, assessing families. Certainly many of the statewide administrative data sets are antiquated and they don't properly identify families coming into the child welfare system or into your court systems with substance use disorders. There's an inability sometimes to provide long-term recovery or aftercare supports. People have told us that there's challenging on or too many family drug courts are more focused on the parent's recovery rather than the family recovery or the child's needs. There's certainly a lack of robust data systems, so evaluation quality is limited in some places, and a lack of sustainable funding. These are some of the things we're hearing as challenges to quality implementation. We could go on, this list could go on quite a while, quite a ways. But what we want to do in terms of setting a standard is saying these are the things that really must be done or should be done in any family drug court. And if you're not there yet, they should be what you're aiming towards. And to give you some terms, we use multiple terms in our work. Oftentimes, and what you just saw were the 7 key ingredients. So these are common practices that we see in effective family drug courts. Then we move up to a guideline or suggested course of action. They're oftentimes policy-based on research or practice evidence. Recommendations are a set of specific practices on research and practice-based evidence, and then a standard, which is really the highest level. It's really a requirement set forth by a state agency, outlines specific practice. here's another way to look at the timelines. Many of you are familiar with the Adult Drug Court Best Practice Standards. The first volume being published in 2013, the second volume being published in 2015. And on the other side over here with the family drug courts, we published our family drug court guidelines document. And if you don't have a copy of that, we'd be happy to get that to you. The first guidelines was published in 2013, and then we did a revision in 2015 because so much research had been published between 2013 and 2015. And I would say now, probably again, and why we're able now to move to standards is because we've seen so much more research and so much new literature being published around the family drug courts that we're able to confidently move into family drug court standards. So here's kind of where we're at. We created an advisory board in June. We had a kickoff meeting at the National Drug Court Conference in July. We began reviewing the 157 strategies that were contained in the Family Drug Court Guidelines. 73 of those were selected for possible inclusion in the Family Drug Court Standards based on the scrutiny of the research that supported those and practitioner consensus on best practices, or what we call practice-based wisdom. We had an advisory group meeting just last week, and we will be looking to publish in the fall of 2018. This is a very cute picture, and usually if I'm with an audience, many people will smile and some will coo and ah. And you should. It is a very cute picture. But one of the kind of nicks that we take as family drug courts is that we're a do-good, feel-good program, and that we don't always have the data that can support that we know this is actually doing good for families, and that we know that we are improving the lives for children and families. And so we need to improve the data, and we need to be monitoring our outcomes in order to ensure that we're implementing these family drug courts with fidelity and to best practices. And standards will help, but we'll also need to continue to monitor your local outcomes to ensure that you're not doing harm and that you are moving towards those 5 R's that I talked about earlier in terms of improving reunification rates, reducing reentries, reducing recurrence, keeping kids home safely. And so we strongly recommend that data dashboards be developed, and on a monthly basis that you're looking at the data that matters most to your community to ensure that you are continuing to implement with fidelity. So I want to pause again and ask for another polling question. What would be most helpful to you in ensuring quality implementation of your family drug court? Would it be a local data dashboard, state standards, and quality assurance, or national standards, or other? Please type in the chat box. We'll give you about a minute to complete this. So it looks like nearly half of you believe that having local dashboards or data snapshots would help you ensure that your quality, or you're implementing quality family treatment courts. A third of you believe that having state standards or state quality assurance systems in place would help ensure quality, and we'll talk about that some. There's opportunities from these standards to also develop peer-to-peer review processes and quality check sheets and court observation tools and staffing observation tools that you can use across your state. And if you want more information on these things or anything that I mentioned today, please reach out to us via email. We'll be happy to talk with you or get you these resources. And then about 16% feel that national standards will help you do this, and then 4% submitted another option in the chat box, and we'll review those after the webinar. So thank you for participating in the poll. Let's move on to goal 2. So we want to expand the reach of family drug courts to keep families together and reduce maltreatment. And I would have to say, of the 3 goals in the National Strategic Plan, this was probably the most discussed goal. It wasn't that people disagreed that family drug courts should grow, but it really was about the wording of this particular goal. And we landed on these particular words very purposefully, that we want to expand the reach of family drug courts. In some states, there's plenty of family drug courts. I won't name states specifically, but in some states there are plenty of family drug courts. However, many are way under capacity, or serving very few clients. And so in those states, it isn't about developing new family drug courts. It's about making sure that those family drug courts are operating at a scale that can move the needle on these outcomes, or operating at least to capacity. In other states, there is a clear need to implement new family drug courts. We still have 15 or so states that have 0 family drug courts. And so there's still a great need to develop and implement new family drug courts. And I would say across the country, and this is where we had lots of discussion when we developed the strategic plan, is that across the country, there's this need, even if you have a family drug court in your community, there's a need to expand the reach of family drug courts through implementing these 7 important ingredients for all cases affected by substance use disorders. And that exact strategy we're testing now in 5 states across the country, in which we're unbundling the family drug court program, the ingredients, the components, and we're beginning to infuse those into the dependency court system and into the larger child welfare system so that we can reach more families. But how can we do this with such limited funding? Most people will ask me and ask us as we go across the country. And what we come back with is, are you getting the fair piece of the pie in your own community? We estimate that family drug court funding receives about $20 million a year, and that fluctuates on the year, on the fiscal year, but about $20 million. Public child welfare receives about $30 billion. So we have 20 million, 30 billion with a B. But if you combine all the federal child welfare programs, and these are just federal dollars, all the federal child welfare programs, you're looking that serve federal child programs, you're looking closer to $470 billion of investment to serve children and families. So we ask you in your own communities, are you getting the fair share of the pie to truly expand the reach of your family drug court? Too often, the family drug court sits kind of off to the side or kind of on top of the landscape, especially if it has a grant. And too many communities rely solely on the grant funding to fund all the services needed for the families. And then when they look outside of the family drug court, they look to other grant-funded programs or projects, demonstrations or pilots that are happening around the community, and too often neglect to look at the real resources already in the community. Your TANF, Medicaid, housing, substance use disorder treatment, block grant funding, those other resources that are there and existing that you may be able to tap into to expand the reach of your family drug courts. And another strategy, and I alluded to this earlier, is that where you're not able to expand or even implement a family drug courts, what are those 7 strategies? Which of these 7 could you begin to implement in your community? We have judges across the country now where they're not able to take more families into their family treatment court, or families that aren't really wanting to sign up for a family drug court, they're ordering the parents to come back to court more frequently, just so they can check up on them to see did they get a substance use disorder assessment? Did they get into treatment? How is treatment going? Have they had visits with their children? They're just bringing the families back into services more frequently. We're seeing that in other places, New York, for instance, has begun to implement this parent-child relationship ingredient using celebrating families across and making that available to families that may not be in the family treatment court, but have these similar issues and can benefit from those types of services. So how might we be able to infuse what works into the larger systems? A few other examples, I'll go through this quickly. In Robeson County, North Carolina, they had worked really hard to implement trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, and they were able to do that through a grant funds and do went through all the barriers that it took to implement that program, the long-term training and supervision and everything it takes. Their sustainability plan was to use Medicaid to bill for those services. However, to bill Medicaid, the children had to be referred by a physician. So the presiding judge there went to the child welfare director and asked the director if they could make it a policy or practice that every child in the family treatment court in Robeson could be seen by a physician and then referred for a trauma assessment. And the child welfare director said to the judge, no, they can't be. Or no, I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is ensure that all children entering the child welfare system in Robeson County are referred to a trauma screening. And so that's one way of infusing or changing systems to reach more families and more children. And due to time, I'm not going to go through all of these examples, but they're in your handouts. But we are seeing that family treatment courts are changing the way in which child welfare and the courts and substance use disorder treatment agencies are changing the way they're doing business. So another innovative way in New York, they created a judicial bench card that could walk through, depending on the stage of the case and where the parent was at, simple questions that the judge could ask each and every single family to ensure that if a family is struggling with a substance use disorder, that they are getting referred and engaged and assessed and getting the proper services that they might need. So here was another polling question, and this one's around expanding the reach. Please indicate the most significant challenge in increasing the scale of your family drug court. Low referrals, lack of effective engagement strategies, lack of cross-system stakeholder buy-in, courtroom capacity, or other. Please enter that in the chat box. We'll give you about a minute. Close this out. Thank you for responding. We also saw in the chat box, folks indicate a lack of funding was a big issue for being able to expand the reach of their family drug courts. We certainly understand that. Looks like the majority of you were saying low referrals, lack of engagement strategies. A third of you said cross-systems collaboration, and just a few of you said the courtroom capacity, which we've been to courts, and that's certainly a barrier. Just the physical space itself doesn't allow you to expand. So thanks for responding to that poll. The third and final goal of the National Strategic Plan is to continue to build the evidence base about what works for family drug courts to improve outcomes for children and parents. And the first strategy is to develop a second-generation research agenda. So what's needed in our field for us to really understand what works in family drug courts and whom it works for. And we need the research to ensure the quality implementation. We need the research to expand because to get those resources that you had just expressed, whether it's partner buy-in or whether it's financial resources, you need the research to say this works better for families. And so we need that evidence to go to the funders, and that won't happen unless we're implementing with quality. So this is an older slide created by Dr. Douglas Marlowe, in which he looked at the science. And again, this is a few years old, so this has been improved since then. But he laid out the science and paralleled that with the standards of law, in which at the time the lowest standard of law would be probable cause. In family drug courts or in dependency courts, we could call that maybe prima facie evidence. On the face of it, it looks like they work. And at this time, and this slide is probably from 2012, to be honest with all of you. So the science and literature has improved for each of these court models. But at the time, juvenile courts was about 25% based on the literature that was out there. Pre-post studies, mixed results, that sort of thing. In juvenile drug courts, there was a lot of analogies and anecdotes. And then moving up to preponderance of the evidence. They've had some experimental or quasi-experimental designs. That's certainly something that has improved in the late 2000s, moving forward from 2010 forward. Many of the federal funders have required that there be comparison groups and evaluations. And so we've been able to benefit from that research in the family drug court arena. And moving more towards clear and convincing evidence. And then beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the highest standard of law, which in science we'd see that there's replicated experiments, quasi-experimental and effectiveness, meta-analysis being done, target populations are clear, and best practices are identified. And again, this being an older slide, we would say, and I think Doug Marlowe would agree, that family drug courts have moved up on this paradigm. But we still need more research, and we need your help in doing this. We continue to need to know who family drug courts work best for and under what types of circumstances. we need to know better about what is the true need of family drug courts. What's the need out there? When we look state by state, there are some states who report to the federal government that only 11%, or in some states less, that less than 10% of all the children removed in their state are removed due to parental alcohol or drug use. So with such lacking data, it's difficult for us, kind of at the national level, to understand what the true need of family drug courts is. If we have a goal to expand the reach to what? What's our target there? And we will only be able to identify that through research and better data. We need to understand how to better match services to need and what types of groups. So in other words, we need to know who needs family drug courts, who do family drug courts work for and why, and we want to better understand or ensure that we have inclusion and equity in family drug courts, that we're not contributing to racial disproportionality and disparity, that we're not, to ensure we're serving young parents just as well as we're serving old parents or older parents. A lot of our national studies, the mean age of the parents in the studies were in the 30s. But when we go out and visit family treatment courts across the country, we're seeing that mean age drop in many places, in which we're seeing 18, 19, 21, 22-year-old parents. Do family treatment courts work just as good for those parents as they do for the 35-year-old parent with a long-term substance use disorder? We need that research. Again, being now in the opioid epidemic, we don't necessarily have the research to say that family drug courts are improve the type of outcomes that we shared with you earlier, because most of the research that has been done in family drug courts has looked at parents with methamphetamine use disorders, cocaine use disorders, marijuana, and alcohol. So we need to really study these types of families so that we know that we're ensuring inclusion and equity. Just to give you one example, and this is a certain set of grantees from one grant program in which we looked at the percent of Hispanic children who entered family drug court programs, and really what we mean by that is their parents have agreed to participate in a family drug court program compared to the child welfare population removed in that same jurisdiction. So what you'll see here is in some places the family drug court is serving a high rate of Hispanic children, and in many places higher than the rate of Hispanic children who were removed in that jurisdiction. In other places it's fairly equal or equitable. And in other places there seems to be some disparities in which Hispanic children, parents were not being served at the same rates as maybe white parents or other ethnicities. This type of data here is not only important at the national level, but it's important in your local level, that you're able to take a look at this. Again, we often encourage you in your courtrooms to just at least do a look test. Does your participants look like the rest of the child welfare system? And we encourage you to be able to collect this type of data and review it frequently to ensure inclusion and equity. Okay, so what can you do? What is it going to take to begin implementing these three goals? Expand the reach of family drug court, ensuring quality implementation, and improving the research base. What will it take? It's going to take some leaderships. It's going to be asking you to test new ideas or to push your partners to test new ideas. And this is a quote from someone: "The old way was not the only way to achieve better outcomes." To prove interdependence, that we can't do this by ourselves. It's not just the courts program. It really needs to be family treatment courts to work better. We'll need to be seeing that this is the child welfare program. This is a treatment program. This is the trauma-focused program. This is a community program. We have to try to create new norms in how we work together, how we get things done. And lastly, it's going to take trust. And that trust comes with accountability and relationships. And again, this quote comes from family drug court practitioners. We've learned that we could count on the other agencies to come through for our families. So we need leaders who will take action. And we're going to ask you, especially those of you that have been in this work for a while, commit yourself to excellent practice and implementation. Improve how we identify children and families who need the family drug court, and reach out to evaluators and researchers to answer those key questions that we looked at. If you feel like in your community today that you are implementing quality family drug courts, and you are pushing, you're proportionately serving the families in need in your communities, and you do have good data to show your outcomes, then what we would ask of you is to reach out to your neighboring jurisdictions and encourage them to come and see what you're doing. We'd encourage you to encourage them to start a family drug court or think about ways they could begin to infuse these critical practices. We encourage you to reach out to your legislators and invite them to come see what you're doing so that we can really spread the word and begin to implement these 3 critical goals. So here's some concrete next steps. First thing, if you haven't already done so, please download a copy of the National Strategic Plan and see how you fit in and you are part of this national movement to advance justice for children. We'd also encourage you to register for our 2018 Family Drug Court Learning Academy webinars, which will begin to break down some of these things in more detail. We will also, in 2018, be having follow-up interactive panels so that you can have discussions with your colleagues about how they're actually doing this work in the communities across the country. And then lastly, engage your team and your governance structures and your committee meetings and how they can be part of implementing the National Strategic Plan and these next steps. Okay, this is the last polling question. Please indicate the most significant challenge in growing your family drug court capacity for program evaluation. So how are you able to, what are some of the challenges you're facing in program evaluation? Is it your data collection systems, your ability just to collect data, or is it the ability to analyze and report on your data? Is it the data quality itself challenging, or other? All right. 40% of you describe the data collection system as the major barrier. Others, just the ability to collect, report, and then about a quarter of you, data quality seems to be a major issue, and we hear that quite often, especially if you're trying to use administrative data, or that sometimes can be a challenge. So thanks again. About 6% of you entered into the chat box, and we will review those responses as well. Go ahead and close out the poll. And so we have a few minutes left for some questions. And some of you have submitted questions via the question box, so we appreciate that. And you can submit questions in a few ways. You can raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and if you called in on your telephone and you've entered your PIN, we'd be able to unmute your line. You can also ask questions through the chat box or through the question box as well. It's located in your panel to the right. Okay, here's a question. So how is the National Strategic Plan encouraging and supporting the transitional youth or younger adults who typically of about age 18 to 23? And that's a very good question, and a question I think that we're beginning to be asked more and more often. And I think the strategic plan helps to address those young adults in a couple ways, actually through each of the 3 goals that I described. First, First, we have to understand the needs of those younger adults. We need to be improving the research and the evidence on what types of programming is needed for younger adults or younger parents. Having a parent who comes into your family treatment court at the age of 21 or 22 and they've been using substances since the age of 13 or 14 years old means that you're essentially treating an adolescent. And so ensuring that your treatment agencies understand the developmental aspects and are ensuring that they're complying or using evidence-based practices for adolescents will be critical. So that's quality implementation. Quality implementation is not just of what you're doing inside your courtroom, but ensuring quality substance abuse treatment, ensuring quality and fidelity of your parent-child interventions, and ensuring quality child welfare practice, such as frequent visitations and quality visitations and those types of other practices. So quality runs across all 3 agencies, and in this case, serving young adults, it means ensuring that the court system understands the developmental needs of these younger adults and younger parents. All right, the next question, are there any tribal courts in family drug courts? Absolutely. So sometimes called family healing to wellness courts, and in fact, this week, while we're having this webinar, there's the National Tribal Healing to Wellness Court conference happening in New Mexico, and some of our colleagues are there presenting a session today and tomorrow, and we're beginning to learn more about what parts of family drug court key practices can be applied and are being applied in the tribal healing to wellness courts. And in fact, one of our grantees is Gila River out of Arizona, and they're working to implement just exactly what we've talked about, actually, and they're improving the quality of their court, they're expanding the reach, and they're improving their research, and we're going to learn a lot about how they're able to do that. And so thanks for that question. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to share with you some resources that you can take back to your teams. The last question that I'll be able to address today, and again, we want to thank you. We received well over 100 questions, and so we appreciate those questions. And if we weren't able to address your question today specifically, but you would like to follow up with us, please do so. I'll give you some contact information and ways to do that in just a moment. So the last question I'll be able to address today is family-centered services are a huge need in our rural area. But this needs to be a state initiative to accomplish this. So in some ways, I guess this is a statement, but I did want to address it. Certainly, and we talk about this quite often, and I hope I reflected it in the slide in which, in order to expand the reach of your family drug courts or improve the quality and the service array that you have in your family treatment courts, doesn't necessarily mean that it has to come just from your own scarce resources. Many of you are stretched thin now. But how can you begin to reach out to the partners in your communities who may already be doing some of this work? And how can you begin to build relationships with those partners to begin having discussions about the resources that they have and discuss with them how you guys are working together for shared outcomes or in ways that you can improve each other's results? And we encourage you to look outside of just your traditional family serving agencies and really understand what's available in your community to try to meet the needs, the comprehensive needs of your families. So we'll leave it there for now. Again, thank you all for your questions. We appreciate all of them and appreciate the time you took. Again, you can download a copy of the National Strategic Plan from our website or from the handouts in your panel box. We will be starting the 2018 Learning Academy. Each of the sessions will have a pre-recorded webinar with a follow-up cafe conversation in which you'll be able to talk to panelists and practitioners who are actually doing the work, and you can ask questions of them and connect with them. So we encourage you to register for the 2018 Learning Academy. We hope that after you've joined the conversation, it'll inspire you to take next steps. So watch, discuss, share and learn, and then do. Each of those academies will also be accompanied by an action planning guide and a discussion guide. Many of you, of course, are aware of this, but we have over 40 webinar presentations on our YouTube channels, 5 learning communities along the family drug court developmental continuum. Many of the presentations also have team discussion guides. So if you're looking for a brown bag to continue your knowledge development of your team members, you might want to go to our website, pick out a webinar to watch as a team, and then have some discussion about what you heard during that webinar. We encourage you to visit our blog. It's there for you. It's familydrugcourts.blogspot.com. All of our webinars are there, family drug court resources, and we try to keep the family drug court news updated as best we can. We have a brand new resource which is actually available through the National Center for Substance Abuse and Child Welfare, and it's Understanding Treatment, a guide for child welfare and court professionals. So we encourage you to download that. Again, you can go to our website to find it or shoot us an email. We'd be happy to send it to you. Brand new, just launched a few months ago, is our Family Drug Court online tutorial. This is really a 101, so that 30% of you or so that were in the early stages of family drug court development or thinking about family drug courts, this is self-paced learning, 5 modules, and you'll receive a certificate of completion once you've completed all the modules and the quizzes at the end of each. So we encourage you to take that tutorial. And if you're new, if you're in a program where it's been around for 5 or 10 years, but you're new to the team, this tutorial may be helpful for you as well. Again, the Family Drug Court Guidelines is available for download. We also encourage you to reach out to one of our peer learning courts. These are the current 9, and they'd love to share their resources with you and their lessons with you. We will be and some of you may have already saw it, we're doing a solicitation for new peer learning courts or mentor courts, and the orientation webinar is at the end of the month. So I'm going to just click through a few of these because I do see we're out of time and I want to be respectful of that. So thank you all for joining today's webinar. Thank you for the work you're doing on behalf of children and families, and we encourage you please to take a moment to complete our evaluation, which you'll be redirected to at the conclusion of the webinar. So again, thanks for all the work and thanks for being here today. With that, we'll close out. Bye-bye.